The number of people using emergency supplies of food from food banks in Britain has increased by 163% in the last year. According to the Trussell Trust, which runs 400 such food banks around the country, they have increased their supply of parcels to about 910,000. That's a tripling in just 12 months. It looks from official statistics that 1 million people now depend on food parcels to supplement what they eat. The Trust's chairman, Chris Mould, described these remarkable figures as shocking in 21st century Britain, adding the statistics are just the tip of the iceberg of UK food poverty. Over 80% of the food banks said more restrictive social security benefits for disadvantaged citizens had driven the rise in numbers being referred for emergency food. The publication of the charity's report coincided with a letter from a number of religious leaders calling on the British government to tackle a national crisis of rising hunger and food poverty. So how bad is the situation in the United Kingdom? Who do the public hold responsible for the vastly increased dependence on food banks in this country? And how do they feel about the negative comments made by some politicians about those who now depend on what amounts to an emergency service? These are the simple questions we sought to answer. We began by asking the public if they'd heard of food banks, what that phrase meant to them, and which countries they felt used them. Here's what they said. Have you heard of food banks? Do you know what they are and which countries might use them?
Vaguely, it rings a bell, but not. I don't know any sort of technical details about them, so not really.
I would assume that a food bank is used by developing countries, so countries that are in need of help, and perhaps a place where people who don't have the money to afford their own food and drink can go and exchange perhaps some kind of vouchers in like a token in exchange for food and drink.
I would imagine the third world countries are predominantly utilising them, but I've not actually come across them before.
Food banks?
Yeah, that's right, food banks. Yeah.
We have food banks in this country.
What do they do?
To an alarming degree. This is giving out food to people who can't afford food, which is why it's getting alarming.
Have you heard of food banks? Do you know what they are and which countries do you think might use food banks?
Well, I know Canada does. America does. Various states in the US do. I would assume Australia and other countries, but I haven't been there, so that's the extent of my travels. So
I have heard of food banks. There's one in my hometown, and I think they're very popular. You know, they provide a service, and I think people are quite surprised in this day and age that food banks need to exist. But I think it's a good way that a community can help each other.
How would you describe what a food bank does?
Well, I think it relies on the generosity of some people, and it allows people who aren't able to make ends meet, you know, to survive, really. I think we live in hard times, perhaps not here in the centre of London, where if you just look around, there's quite a lot of wealth around, but in, you know, out of London, small towns, you know, people are struggling, you know, that they're having to live within very tight means, prices everywhere, you know, utilities, food, it never comes down, and in fact it's probably doubled in the past few years. So yeah, no, they exist for a reason. They wouldn't be there otherwise, I don't think.
I have never heard about it. I don't know what it is. I have no idea.
So is there a formal definition of what a food bank actually is, and what countries do use them? We turn to our experts for clarification.
There's a global food banking network of around 25 or 30 countries, and that is increasing all the time. In the UK, a lot of them are run by an organisation called the Trussell Trust, who also manage the Waterloo Food Bank. There are around 400 Trussell Trust food banks throughout the UK, and what we provide is emergency food for those families in need. It's 3 days worth of non-perishable food, pasta, rice, tinned tomatoes, that kind of stuff, for those families in our community who are most vulnerable and can't afford to put food on their tables.
There's no internationally recognised agreed definition of food banks in different countries, and even within countries there's different understandings of what that means. But more broadly, if you think about emergency food aid provision, it's in a number of different countries, and and that varies, but we know about it in the States, in Canada, Germany, amongst other countries.
So now we know what food banks are. How prevalent are they in the United Kingdom? We asked the public to guess the answer to that question. How many people would you guess in the United Kingdom, if any, would be using food banks?
Well, it actually rings a bell because I think I saw something on the news quite recently about an increasing number of people requiring to use food banks, actually. So, but percentage-wise, 20%. I don't know.
I'd say in the hundred thousands, because like there's a lot of homeless people and like there's shelter everywhere. So I'd say 100,000 definitely.
I'd say about 70%.
How many people in Britain do you think are actually dependent on food banks now?
I've been led to believe more and more people are dependent on it, hence the abject call and need for it. They're not what you'd expect of Britain being one of the world's superpowers, that there'll actually be people in their need of food. Taking back in the days when I would read books and there were what we called food stamps. It pretty much almost amounts to it now, which you wouldn't expect of Britain today.
I would imagine that there'd be a lot of people that would want to use it. I suppose the amount of people that do use it would be dependent on publicity and awareness.
Based on my earlier answer, I would assume not very many, given that I would estimate that it's for developing countries. A very low percentage, if any at all.
So that's the public's estimate of the use of food banks in the UK. We turn to our experts to give a factual analysis of how much food banks have become a part of British life.
In the last year, almost 1 million people, including 330,000 children, were fed by Trussell Trust food banks. In Waterloo alone, we've been set up for just over 2 years now, and we've fed thousands upon thousands of families. In the last year, we fed 2,100 families, including 800 children in Waterloo.
That's not something we can say definitively, but the Trussell Trust recently released statistics that said over 900,000 people had used their food banks in the past year. That doesn't take into account all the independent and other food aid provision that's going on in the UK. That's only one organisation's food banks, but we don't have the data for the others.
Many people find it remarkable that the number of users of food banks in the UK has increased from around 350,000 up to something just less than 1 million. Well, we asked the public what they thought of that rise. In the last 12 months or so, the dependence on food banks in the UK has tripled, up to just under 1 million people now. How do you feel about that figure?
That's staggering. It's the way the economy's been going. Certainly not just for the EU, but for the rest of the world. I know North America, it's pretty bad as well. So I have friends and relatives in Canada, and I know it's pretty rough there. I mean, they're doing better than the US, but yeah, no, I didn't realize it was that high.
I think given what a wealthy country we are, it's quite an appalling state of affairs if there's 1 million people that have to rely on that source of a day-to-day essential item that the rest of us just take for granted. And you look around an area like the West End where there's just so much surplus food and excess in terms of the restaurant trade, that's actually quite tragic that there's that many people that can't actually meet the daily requirements of food for their family.
Well, it's shocking in an affluent country, really, isn't it? It's something that you associate with poverty-stricken countries, maybe, in the third world. So, yeah, no, it is shocking. It is.
In actual fact, in the UK, the number of people using food banks has tripled in the last 12 months to 1 million people now. Yeah. How do you feel about that?
That's crazy. It's so crazy that me personally, person don't really need to use it, wouldn't actually hear about it. I think there should be more promotions or advertisement on around the area to show people that it's available for people, because a lot of people tend to start begging, and I think it's a very great idea.
I find that shocking. I knew that it was a growing issue, but 1 million? What's the population? 60 million? Maybe more now. That's a huge proportion.
Well, I think it's appalling, really, because
People need to survive on a day-to-day basis. It's a struggle as it is even looking for a full-time job or a part-time job. Even with qualifications, you can't get a job just because you haven't got these certain qualifications. So it's quite appalling, really. There needs to be something sorted or something done about it.
Quite a lot of surprise then amongst the public about that massive escalation on dependence on food banks in the UK. We wondered if there was some social or economic reason for this and turned to our experts for advice.
It doesn't surprise me, unfortunately. Running a food bank is a funny old project because you always wish you could close it down. You wish that there was no demand for your service and you wish that people weren't coming through the door needing food. But the Trussell Trust nationwide have seen an increase of about 50% in the last year alone. But we've seen an increase in the Waterloo area of 135%. We've seen more and more people every single week coming to use our services. So it doesn't surprise me that the numbers have tripled nationwide. But it does sadden me. It's a real shame to see that there is such a need for this.
No, it doesn't surprise me. And in fact, we would say that that figure is far higher because the figure you've just quoted is actually just the Trussell Trust's food banks. As I said, just over 900,000 people have been to Trussell Trust in the past year. And this excludes all of the independent and other organisations' food banks. It is unfortunately not surprising at all. And it's something that we think really needs to be done about it. This is the 7th richest country in the world. People shouldn't have to be going hungry. Today, the public health officials put out a statement saying that something needs to be done to stop children from being malnourished because people can't afford a healthy diet anymore. And this is just indicative of the problem that we're seeing at food banks.
Recently, some Conservative politicians criticised users of food banks, describing them with the word shameless. We wondered how the public would react to usage of that kind of language against those people who depend on food banks for their food. Some Conservative politicians have recently said that those who go to food banks are actually shameless. What's your reaction to that kind of comment from our politicians?
I think that's a classic response from a Conservative MP. So,
what do you mean?
Well, generally Conservatives, MPs would not necessarily have to use a food bank, so it means nothing to them in my eyes. So. And I think that's a pretty disgusting thing for...
They're quite keen on banks, though.
Yeah, I'm sure they are.
I'd be very surprised if anyone described anyone that's in need of help and care as being shameless. I think it'd be a very naive approach to think that someone uses a food bank for anything other than they're in a situation of desperation or absolute need. So, yeah, it would be a shameless thing to say. Agreed.
People that are the people that do run the country, for me personally, they look out for their own pocket. Like, as my friend was saying earlier, like, people go to university, they're given loans, and then when they come out of university, it's like they end up in a retailers, in a Boots or in a Sports Direct. So for me personally, like, what the government's doing, and for the Conservative Party to say that is shameless, I'd love to see them on the street or going to a food bank to try and get that food, because at the end of the day, like, we're put on this earth by one person. Like, we shouldn't be able to fight for. Obviously, we're fighting every day, but for someone to say that it's disrespectful or shameless, that's just wrong. I don't like that.
Some Conservatives have said that people who use food banks are shameless. How do you feel about people who are running the country criticising those dependent on food banks in that way?
I don't think that criticising people dependent on food banks is a fair stance to take. I think that if people are dependent on them, then it's because they need to ask for help. And it's a reflection of circumstance as opposed to laziness.
I can speak for myself.
Yeah, it's all about your views.
Yeah. I would think that if I'm going to a food bank, I've exhausted every avenue and option available to me, and that I'm now at the lowest at the low, in which case you should welcome them and help them get back to being independent and fending for themselves, because as far as I know, like speaking for myself, there's meant to be that inherent pride in doing stuff for yourself and helping those around you to equally it's had more independence.
To be honest, if they put themselves in the same shoes as the people with no money, for example, if you have no job and you're a foreigner to the country and you have no option and you have no family here, that's the only place they can actually turn to. I'd like to see them in the same position as them, and we'll see what they'll do.
You'd like to see a few politicians in the queue?
Yeah, I'd like to see them and see if they have any money. If they don't have any money, I would like to see what they will do to get some food to eat or feed their families.
So general condemnation from the public against politicians who have been so negative about those using food banks. We wondered if the experts shared that perspective or could offer further insight about why food banks have provoked such a negative response from some of the people who run the country.
We work on the front line, we see people every day, and I am yet to see anyone who is coming to take advantage of the system. The people that we see don't want to come to food banks, they don't want to be there, they want to be able to go down to the shop like everybody else and to be able to afford to buy food and put food on the table. I would be very surprised if there are many people trying to take advantage of the system, but even those who may be trying to take advantage are doing so out of desperation. They're not doing it just because they can get free food, they're doing it because in this culture, in this context, there is no other way of them putting food on the families' tables.
Well, it's completely untrue, and the government's own research demonstrated that it is not, people are not going to food banks because they're around, so it's not supply driven. It's actually people are going because it's the last possible resort. They've tried everything else, and this is the last possible option that they've got. We often find that people are actually deeply ashamed of going to food banks and feel that they have failed, particularly if they're parents and they're going to have to feed in order to feed their children. I would say it's the complete opposite, and the government's own research has demonstrated that.
So, having discussed food banks with the public, we wondered who they held responsible or blamed for the massive increase in their usage in the United Kingdom. Here's what they said. Putting all that together, who do you hold responsible or blame for this massively increased dependence on food banks in a first world country like the United Kingdom?
Well, I think one can be broad about it. I think the economy is one very heavy factor on it. Trade management and so on, dependence on goods, export of goods and so on. I mean, just to be able to produce things in the United Kingdom and send them out and have them consumed properly, whether they be automotive or industrial or foodstuffs. So.
I don't know enough about it to actually comment on who would be responsible for it, unfortunately.
I blame the government because they put on job seekers, but job seekers don't really give you enough money to be able to survive for them 2 weeks. They give you all types of options, but them options, they always try and stop you from getting them type of options. On top of that, without the right qualifications, you can't even get a job in this country. So I blame the government. They should be doing something about it to prevent this from happening. That's what I think it is.
I'm sort of a bit wishy-washy. I don't know who to blame, but it's very hard if you see people, I've got to say that word, bankers, getting enormous wadges of money that people who never have opportunity, it's not jealousy, if you work hard, but why do they think they work harder than anybody else to get that massive amount of money? I just think the system's skew-whiffed. So, I don't know really, but I think people, keep talking about the economy, and it has, you have to pay the best people the amount. Well, I might be the best person for my job, but I wouldn't expect to be earning millions. I've never got a bonus, and I think I'm a conscientious, hard-working person too.
Who would you hold responsible for the increased dependence on food banks in 21st century Britain?
That's a tricky question.
It's a simple question, just a hard answer.
I think it's a combination of greed, certain sectors of industry in this country, and possibly it's a bit of an abomination of a government from the Labour Party, and that's just extended into what we've got now. So it's just a bit of a mess. I think the people that need the help the most aren't getting it, and there's a bit of a gap developing between those that have what they need to live and more versus those people that don't. So Who's responsible? I don't know. People who vote, I'd say.
I think mostly is that my personal thing is that a lot of people, even if they go to university, they end up being in debt, thousands of pounds. They come out, they can't even get a job in their own base career. What happens? A lot of them end up going to retail jobs, which basically what they make is just covers them, saves them. Basically, they're surviving to pay their rents, and a lot of them have no money for the remaining 3 weeks after they get paid. They have no money. So what happens? If they go to the food bank to survive, I actually blame the government, to be honest with you.
Osborne, Duncan Smith.
Because?
And of course Cameron for presiding over the entire charade.
Do you think they could have stopped it?
Of course they could.
How was that?
If they'd had an ounce of compassion and were prepared to listen at all to any of the complaints and concerns about the impact of all those cuts, then it wouldn't have happened. But it's pure ideologically driven, and to try and convince the Daily Mail and their core supporters back home that however iffy they are on other things, they are tough on immigration and tough on scroungers and all that nonsense.
So clearly the public, by and large, do blame the politicians for the massive increase in dependency on food banks in the UK. We gave the last word to our experts and asked them if there was a clear linkage between what politicians have done and what's happened when it comes to food banks.
I don't think it's that useful to try to apportion blame here. For us, we are just trying to make sure that the people in our community can afford to eat. And so for us, it's not about looking at what the problem is, it's about looking at what we can do going forward from this point. I think that food and being able to afford to eat has got to be one of the most basic human rights there possibly can be. And it is an absolute disgrace that in the 6th richest economy in the world, that there are people in central London who can't afford to do that. So I think rather than attributing blame to anyone, we should look at the rising cost of living and say, what can this government do to make sure that people are better supported and can afford to eat?
I think that's a very complex question that's too difficult to kind of unpack here, but I think there are many factors involved. There needs to be responsibility at all levels, I think, but the government needs to do more to ensure that people aren't going hungry in this country.
We've always had food banks, but in 21st century Britain, the poverty of support for the least well off has caused the number of these to triple. Britain is so economically weak that a large number of people now resort to those food banks just to feed themselves and their families. For all the talk of economic prosperity, the social divide is so great that the rich get richer and the poor go hungry. So while millionaires work in the money banks, their clients walk to the food banks. And that raises more simple questions with very uncomfortable answers.